Okay, so thank you for joining us for this seminar on legislative theatre. I'm Anna Przybylska. I work at the Center for Deliberation at the Faculty of Sociology, University of Warsaw. And I'm privileged to have guest speakers with us who are knowledgeable about legislative theatre, and they've got expertise and experience in using the methods. And these, our panelists include Dena Arya from the University of Birmingham, United Kingdom, and Bartłomiej Bodziński-Guzik from Jagiellonian University Legislative Theatre Center, Poland, and Roberto Falanga, University of Lisbon, Portugal, and Katy Rubin, the People Act Legislative Theatre, United Kingdom. And among our contributors in the larger group, as we gathered, we have academics, but also practitioners from institutions and NGOs. And I think it's important because the method, its use requires intersectionality, so collaboration. So it's good to know each other's perspectives and to make it work, to make it happen. I would like also to acknowledge the inspiration from the Inspire project, because we were encouraged to organize this seminar by the larger team that's from the Inspire project. And we will start with a short film and the warm-up game proposed by our expert in legislative theatre, Katy. And then we will initiate a conversation around the general questions, and we will continue the conversation with your contribution, your questions. So let's start. Bartek, will you play the film, please?
Yes.
What if every citizen could be a policymaker? In a time of rising inequalities, climate crisis, and breakdown of public trust, we need many diverse actors working together to shape the policies and laws that will make our communities more livable, equitable, and sustainable. One tool is legislative theatre, which originated in the streets and council chambers of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in the 1990s, out of the tradition of theatre of the oppressed. Since then, it's taken off around the world, and momentum is growing. How does it work? Communities who are directly impacted by unjust or ineffective policies come together to play games, tell stories, and build scenes based on their shared lived experiences. In public legislative theatre events, neighbors, advocates, and policymakers gather to watch the play and identify problems as they are experienced every day, building a shared understanding. Audience members are invited on stage to improvise creative solutions to the problems, to test and refine their ideas together. This is a shared experience of problem solving. Finally, everyone drafts policy proposals, engaging in deliberation and debate until it's time to vote. And then decision makers present make commitments to immediate actions. Voting is a joyous act. Everyone becomes a policymaker, working together and taking shared risks, and the traditional power dynamics are turned upside down. Over the past 30 years, legislative theatre processes have led to concrete changes in cities, regions, and national contexts. In Zimbabwe, it's been used to shape climate policy. In the UK, to address gendered harassment in public spaces. In Brazil, to advance domestic workers' protections. And in Austria, to develop new legislation on disability rights. And these are just a few examples out of many.
And yeah, this is the moment for a warm-up game, I suppose.
Thanks, Bartek. Thanks, Anna. Hello, everyone. So, as you've just seen, we're talking about processes where power dynamics get turned upside down and everyone works together in an environment that's shaped by fun and playfulness. That's really the ethos of legislative theater. And since we're saying that it's participatory and everyone is an active citizen, even an actor and a policymaker, we're all, even today, going to warm up. So I'm very sorry, but I'm going to ask you to turn your cameras on if you can, at least just for a few minutes, so we can play a little game. There you go. I see some smiles, maybe some grimaces. It's okay. I can take it all. So you'll need your hands free. You can just stay right there on your Zoom screen. Love it. Cameras on. Beautiful. Beautiful. Wonderful. Okay. So I'm just going to give a couple of instructions. You can just play along right there on your Zoom screen. Even if your camera's off, please join us. So first, I'm going to ask everybody to move. Just do a little dance in your screen, have a little movement. There you go. Wake up, whatever time it is where you are, and stop. Excellent. And move. There you go. There you go. You can rock out. Nice dancing. I love it. And stop. Move. There you go. You can cry too. That's great. And stop. You're doing great. You're doing so well that now I'm going to flip it around. When I say move, you stop. And when I say stop, you move. Okay, are you ready? Move. Stop. Move. Move. Stop. Stop. Oh, good. And move. Great, great. You're getting it. You're getting it. So we're going to add two more in because we don't want it to get too easy. So now I'm just going to say head. When I say head, touch your head. And when I say shoulders, touch your shoulders. Head, shoulders. Beautiful. Head, shoulders. What do you think we're going to do? Switch it. That's right. So when I say head, you touch your shoulders. When I say shoulders, you touch your head. Ready? Let's go. Shoulders. Head. Head. Shoulders. Move. Ah, very good. Move. Ah, stop. There you go. There you go. There you go. Move. Head. Shoulders. Shoulders. Head. Move. Oh, okay. What do you think? Can we add just two more words in? Two more words? Can we up? Listen, we got a lot of problems. Come on, Olivia. We got a lot of problems in this democracy. We got to fix. So we got to stretch ourselves here. We can do it. Okay. When I say close, just close your eyes one time. Close. And when I say open, open your eyes wide. Close. Open. Close. Open. What do you think we're going to do? Switch it. So when I say close, you open. When I say open, you close. Let's try. Close. Open. Open. Close. All right. We've got move, stop, head, shoulders, open, close. Are you ready? Are you ready? Okay. Move. Stop. Stop. Move. Head. Shoulders. Shoulders. Head. Open. Close. Close. Open. Move. Stop. Move. Head. Shoulders. Hey, give yourselves a round of applause. That was amazing. That was amazing. That was amazing. All right. So just very quickly in the chat or out loud, how's anybody feeling? Feeling a little bit upside down, anybody? Yeah? Let's see. Great. I got something in the chat. Great. Feeling good. Excellent. Feeling good. Maybe feeling a little bit energized. Maybe feeling a little bit confused. So when we start a legislative theater process, we play a game like this. to have fun, build community, feel energized, feel curious, but also start to think about what rules we live within and how we respond to them individually, as a collective, to think about what are those rules that we want to keep and what are those rules that aren't working for us, that are unjust or ineffective, as we saw in the video, right? That we might want to turn upside down. And this kind of game could lead us into a conversation about some of those rules on any specific issue, like we heard about in the video, that would take us into what are the specific stories and policy questions that we need to look at, right? What is not working in our housing system, in our transport system? What are the things that we respond to in the same way all the time, but we want to turn upside down? And we also start a full legislative theater event like this when we come together with policymakers, with our play, to say, wait a minute, we're all policymakers here. We're not believing in this division between people and deciders. We're saying everybody can frame the problem and everybody can come up with solutions. Everybody's an analyst and everybody's a creator of new interventions. And if we can start with something that gets us a little bit playful, gets us laughing, changes that environment to one where actually we're all going to fail because we're all citizens here together, that's when we're ready to do legislative theater. So I hope you're now feeling ready. Maybe we're going to think a little bit upside down today. And you could imagine, as you saw that video, as you saw those games, how this process works. I'm going to pass it back to Anna and Dena in a minute. But just to hold that with you and think about what you saw, when everything we're talking about playing stories, scenes, and then watching, analyzing, acting to change things, turning those into proposals and voting. Watch, act, propose, vote. That's legislative theater in a nutshell. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you so much. It's so much different from our experience with mini publics, and that's why I would like to ask Dena to help us situate this method in relation to other methods of deliberation and participation involving citizens. What are the similarities and what are the differences? Dena.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here and looking forward to having this conversation with everybody. I'm hoping to kind of kick off the conversation by offering some of my reflections based on experiences that I've had in research in the past, but also the work that we're doing on the Inspire project of different kinds of participatory and deliberative democratic processes. So in particular, I'm thinking about citizens' assemblies, participatory theatre and legislative theatre process that we used on Inspire. And these three methods exist on a spectrum from participatory to deliberative and have really some shared foundations, which is in general true of all forms of participatory and deliberative democracy. And that really is to kind of challenge top-down decision-making and to deepen democratic participation that uses more inclusive and dialogical processes and kind of expands and goes beyond practices, democratic practices that are institutionally led. And the key to all of these methods, at least in my experience, that the thread of that has been that participation is, as a value, is an intrinsic good. And thinking a little bit about, some of the major similarities and differences that I observed in three research projects in particular, one of which looked at intersectional inequalities in youth climate action in the UK, where I did ethnographic observations at the UK climate crisis, climate change citizens assembly. The other one was a project called the Theatre of Climate Action. This was a project in Guadeloupe in South Africa, comparatively supporting young people from these countries to have a platform from which to share their lived experiences of climate injustice. And the project in Inspire, where we use legislative theatre to support young people to work on addressing policy issues in the West Midlands around youth unemployment. And what was quite interesting in terms of similarities between these, in particular, the Theatre of Climate Action and the Inspire project with young people in the West Midlands was the potential to build democratic capabilities. It was particularly interesting to see how young people's agency and sense of community built over the course of these processes. In the Inspire process, young people worked on youth employment policy, but also developed confidence to call in policymakers, to challenge power dynamics and to build stronger communities through a fun, it's really important that Katy mentioned that, this fun and joyful, creative collaboration. And that was very much similar to what was happening for the young people at the Theatre of Climate Action. In South Africa, it was very interesting because young people who started the process didn't see themselves as activists or as political agents, and they didn't feel that they had the legitimacy to have this conversation platformed because they were not activists. But by reflecting on their lived experience through a creative method, they began to understand how their everyday realities were shaped by the politics of the climate crisis, and their performance really tackled broader themes of capitalism and the Anthropocene. They titled their performance, "Are We Worth Saving?" And beyond the project, a lot of them, as similarly did the young people in the Inspire project, engaged in political action, got involved in community and social organizing, and some in more policy-related work. In terms of the differences, well, in contrast, contrasting TOCA, Theatre of Climate Action, and Inspire with my ethnographic work, whilst it did have similarities in that, it was about bringing people together to collectively problem solve, it was heavily reliant on rational discourse and consensus. And they certainly have their place. And have become very popular as a deliberative democratic process, particularly with national and local governments. They, in my experience, can also hijack, if poorly designed, the process and can actually risk excluding more marginalized voices from setting the agenda and lack the creativity and the emancipatory kind of dimensions that methods like legislative theatre certainly offer. And that's where, for me, legislative theatre really stands out. And I must admit, on entering the project for Inspire, I was quite skeptical. Having had those experiences of observing how climate, how at least within the climate arena, how citizens' assemblies had been utilised by institutions, I was, a little unsure about how it was going to make practical change in young people's lives. Through the process, we've seen with our youth co-creators that combining performance rooted in lived experience and in dialogue with community members and policymakers and other local partners, young people were really able to begin the process of embedding change. So, for example, one of those changes was that now policymakers are co-designing reforms to make work experience more inclusive in the West Midlands, which is a fantastic outcome. By contrast, citizens' assemblies, in my experience, can struggle to deliver on those more tangible impacts. And participatory theatre projects without kind of a policy hook, like climate action work that can often be quite broad, can raise awareness, but might often lack the mechanisms for that systemic change. So legislative theatre has a really beautiful synergy there where it's able to take both dialogic processes and creative arts and joy and fun and play and work towards systemic change. So that's something that just to give a kind of a wrap up of my answer, that whilst all the methods really do aim to democratize and support decision making, legislative theatre blends the art and the policy to build on that impact work. And I really look forward to hearing from colleagues a little bit more. I know that we're going to hear from Bartek now and give us another insight possibly on citizens' assemblies. Over to you.
Yes, Bartek, if you could build on that and tell us why would you choose legislative theater and not citizen assembly, for example, in what circumstances?
Thank you, Anna, and welcome again, everyone. Very happy to be here. I think I would like to extend this question a little bit and think also about other participatory approaches and methods versus legislative theater. Dena spoke a little bit about the rigidity of assemblies, for example, of mini publics, and I think this is one of the important differences, that legislative theater, despite certain framework, allows for much more flexibility. And when we think about legislative theater as participatory process, and this is how I think about it, with any participatory process, legislative theater included, we need to be sure that this is suitable for the problems and for the context that we are going to use it within. So the first thing is, I would use legislative theater when it's more suitable than other methods. And then as we saw at the video, the principle behind legislative theater is and theater of the oppressed in general, is to have those directly affected by social problems to participate, to become actors, but also to be the majority of the audience. And when we think, for example, about the mini publics, where we have this demographic element of representing the bigger society, and then we can have this microcosmos that is also replicating the society within the assembly. And it is often raised that the power dynamics can be replicated there. So what I would say that legislative theater allows us to do is allows us to reach out to this knowledge that is hidden within the lay expertise, not the very general public expertise. And we can think about issues such as homelessness, experience of refugee community, people with disabilities. And it is clear that not every member of the society has the lived experience of those issues. So I would say when we cannot gather enough data, or when we cannot reach out to this lay expertise because we are not equally affected, we should and we could turn out to the legislative theater. And what is more important is that those examples I gave, unfortunately, are often linked with less access to other democratic institutions, which means that more common things like consultations and assemblies and citizens panels and so on are not inclusive enough, while the problems we want to tackle and the groups affected by those problems are being in a way excluded twice. And legislative theater is something that is breaking with this division, also through the fun and being more accessible. And I think the last aspect to mention is that also legislative theater, through these theatrical games and focusing on particular problem as seen through the eyes of the groups affected, allows us to break with this group homogeneity bias. So this idea that everyone in the group experience the problem in the same way. I can give example of climate change, which we are all affected in a way, but we are all affected, not all, but we are affected in different manners. Because, for example, in the big cities, we speak about car pollution and so on, while in the rural areas, we can speak about, access to clean energy and so on and so on. So I think legislative theater is also very suitable when we want to go in deep into the problem. So to sum up, first of all, when it's more suitable, when the problem is not very well researched, and also when we want to ensure the access to the groups that otherwise cannot participate effectively through other methods.
Yes, so we know that the method originated in Rio de Janeiro, but its scope and scale developed. So, Katy, can you draw the map for us?
Sure. So as we learned before, the legislative theater, like other kinds of participatory democracy, particularly participatory budgeting, came originally from Brazil. In the early 1990s, when this kind of activist theater maker, Augusto Boal, accidentally became a member of Rio de Janeiro City Council and first of all, the story is that he went into the city council and said, oh, I have to write a law. And he tried to write a law and it was really bad. And he said, wait a minute, that's what I've already learned from all the work I've done, that actually the community who's directly impacted needs to A, again, frame the problem, and B, be part of creating the solution, testing it, deliberating, etc. And then in the 4 years that he was in the council, he brought in the groups that were creating these theater scenes about their lived experience of problems, from women who are incarcerated, who are not able to access to be with their babies after their babies were born, to young teenagers who wanted to go to the free and better, highly rated universities but couldn't afford the entrance exam. And how do you solve those problems through new policy, through new rules? And in that process, 13 new laws were passed in Rio, and that was really the beginning of legislative theater. And since then, as Anna said, it's really been taking off, I would say, very much in the last 10 years. So more than 70 countries use this participatory process called Theater of the Oppressed. And now, just in the last few weeks, Bartek and I actually launched a map of legislative theater projects around the world, which includes about 20 countries, already 35 projects. There's many, many more. So, for example, starting in 2013, the organization I used to work with started using legislative theater in New York City with the New York City Council on all kinds of issues: homelessness and housing, rights of trans youth to proper identification, people coming out of prison and their access to housing, to jobs, to loans, to student loans, all this kind of stuff. And actually making policy change, working directly with city council and advocacy organizations and the people impacted. So everyone would come together for an event, and as we learned, come up with these proposals and make commitments, and then follow up and see sometimes the policy action, just like Dena said and other people. We see in all kinds of participatory democracy, we don't always see the results that we want and the follow through. But something about bringing all these different stakeholders together in this space and in this environment of fun, right? And really, really basing it in the urgent experience, the lived experience, we are seeing a lot of impact. So now there's legislative theater happening around the UK, national government, local government, community and neighborhood level, around other countries, Poland, Romania, Spain. Lots of folks who are here have been involved in legislative theater processes, from the rights of migrant workers to LGBTQ student rights in Poland to reproductive rights, to public safety for women and girls in public transport, to all even really kind of big, tricky future issues. Like, I've just worked on a project with national government here in the UK on students' rights to their work in the face of AI in education, and what are their rights actually to their copyright and even to be compensated if companies are making money off their homework. So these are the kinds of things that maybe are difficult for us to conceptualize and are really, really bringing very different power dynamics into the room. We're talking national government, high school students, and Google, right? And what is a framework that you can use to bring those folks together? So one of the things that we're working on now, and I think one of the impetus partly for this webinar and something that we as practitioners experience all the time, is how do we get folks in government and democracy practitioners and academics to really take seriously arts-based participatory mechanisms, as well as the more sort of deliberative Western, evidence-based traditional expertise that we see really growing quickly. When, as Bartek said, we need to center the lived experience, or we need to bring together different stakeholders in a different way, we need to overturn power dynamics, or we need to come up with really radical and creative solutions. And so one of the things we're doing is tracking the policy impacts of those projects happening all over the world. And we'll talk more about it in the Q&A, but that's something that we invite you all to help us think about. As this tool is really growing, how do we ensure that essentially government and academia and practitioners are following along and understanding that there's really many different ways to do participatory democracy, and we need to be able to meet the challenges or the communities where they are.
Perfect. So, Roberto, would you share with us your experience of adapting the methods to the context in Lisbon, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, hi, everybody. To start with, I mean, I'm not, or at least I don't consider myself as an expert in legislative theater, but I want to share a bit the experience that we just had in Lisbon. When I say just, I mean it was really yesterday. We had this legislative theater on the 5th of December. And our practice was framed with the EU project Inspire that was already introduced. So what we did was to critically reflect on the intersectional inclusion of people with physical disabilities in the city. And so we have been co-creating the process over more or less 1 year and something, with three performers, the three performers with disabilities. And so we set up this theater called Reunião. In Portuguese, it means meeting, because the idea was to kind of reproduce the setting of an assembly of with the audience. And the process so was co-designed with artists, and this makes some difference. I will tell a bit more in a minute. And so what we have done, it's been, to me, as a personal experience as a researcher, very different from other processes of participation and deliberation that I've been engaged with, like participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, but also other processes related more to urban planning and urban regeneration. And let me already say that to me, this has been one of the most powerful practices of participation that I've been involved in, since I've never seen policy and law so much at the very center stage of the participation of the participatory experience. Now, to say what we have done differently compared to other legislative theaters, I would stress three main adaptations, more than changes. There are adaptations that we have done according to the topic, according to the context, but also according to the group of people that we have engaged with. The first is the movement on stage. So legislative theater is about acting, and Katy already, and the video already, I think we're already clear about it. In our case, it was a bit problematic to reproduce the movement on stage. And the people on stage actually felt less comfortable with that. So they decided not to perform physically the stories, but rather to tell the stories. So the storytelling was the very center of the performance. And they themselves understood storytelling as a powerful means through which the barriers could be also experienced in the audience. And let me say that it worked. A second adaptation that was done related to the selection of the policy areas. So as I said, policies and laws were at the very center of our co-creation process. But maybe slightly different from what happens generally in the legislative theater. The performers selected 4 main policy areas rather than 1, for example. In our case, they were employment, mobility, housing, and independent living. And these were selected from the bottom up. So it was about the stories that were shared by the people on stage that we have been also rehearsing during before the legislative theater itself. And so through their stories, through their personal stories, we tapped into these 4 policy areas. Now, of course, what we have tried to do also with the help of Katy was to identify beforehand which strategies, which laws, which revisions of laws were ongoing, because what we wanted to do, and this is something that is common to all legislative theaters, is to and make sure that there is a strong policy uptake after the performance. So we wanted to be sure that there was a discussion ongoing at the political level. So now we are actually in the phase of doing this connection. And finally, another adaptation that we did was about the uptake, the final voting of the proposals. It normally works through like you can use cards, green and red cards. In our case, the performers decided to use the traditional method of raising hands. But this meant that we only focused on agreements. However, what we did as a midterm was to give time after the voting for commenting on the proposals themselves, so the final proposals. So basically, instead of voting no, we gave the chance and we gave time for people to say whether they were concerned about specific proposals or they wanted to change something in the formulation of the proposals. So I don't know if I have another minute. I just wanted to wrap up saying that, as I said, this was very rewarding to me in terms of practice as a researcher, of course, but also as a practitioner of these kind of initiatives. But as you can understand, I mean, along with the rewarding aspects, there are also challenging aspects. As a researcher, I can tell you very openly that to me it was very challenging at the beginning to unpack all those differences that are within the concept of minority that we are used to use in research and not just in research, and really understand how every time we talk about inclusion of minorities, we have to be able to make the due differences among the minorities that we want to address and that we would like to engage with. And then another challenge, but maybe I can leave this for the Q&A, it has to do with the engagement of artists in these arts-based methods for participation. I think it made a big difference in our case to work with artists. I think that there is a tension here between the idea of co-creating something together and the creative act that the artist want to give to his or her performance. But yeah, this is just an open reflection. I don't have an answer, so maybe we want to discuss this later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberto. And I witnessed one of the rehearsals, and it was very moving in Lisbon. And it made me actually to organize this event to learn more and facilitate learning. So yeah, it had consequences. Okay, so yes, so it would be really good to know your personal stories more. I mean, Roberto just shared, but what made you, like each of you, to try this method? What's inspired you to try? What's motivated you? What was the story behind? If I may, anyone who wishes to start, I don't know, first. Dena?
Sure. The Inspire project, the selection of legislative theatre had been made when I joined the Inspire project, but to think about what led me to take that role and join the team. Like I said before, I was very skeptical of participatory democratic processes that said, yeah, we're going to make a policy change, we're going to support marginalized communities. I wanted to believe that these processes could have meaningful, impactful change. And I think for me, what really made it, and what made me really understand, no, hold on a minute, this is about real bottom-up practice. This is about thinking much more carefully and considerately about the ideas of marginalization and how you engage with communities, as Roberto says, like, how do you even do this kind of work? And that was about the intersectional perspective that the team had, that across Inspire, the intersectional perspectives and continually reflecting on ourselves and our role and our positionality and who we are in the space and how we're affecting the space and the way we recruited and you know included our co-creators, our collaborators, that kind of convinced me to stay and to really believe in the process. Ultimately, seeing is believing, right? Having gone through the process and learned how legislative theatre works and seeing the young people in the West Midlands make real life change and have developed a sense of political agency through that process has been such an incredible thing to see that you can't really be a cynic after seeing something like that.
I can jump in. I guess for me, it's pretty straightforward, or came from a kind of simple question for me. I grew up in an activist family and went to a lot of protests and felt like and protest is super important, and I still do it. And I think that I just was struck by how sometimes in the process of trying to protest or demonstrate for tolerance, I would see these kind of planning meetings that were so intolerant and boring and full of anger. And I said, no wonder no one's showing up and we're not able to stop wars or whatever it was that we were trying to do. And I guess my essential question was, can we work towards a better world in a way that is joyful and inviting? Can we make it as sexy and fun and exciting for people to show up for social change and democracy as it is to watch Netflix and to go to the football game and to do all these other things that we're not really having to work hard to get people to do? And that's my essential question. Will we show up for the revolution if it isn't fun? And before that, will we show up for democracy if it isn't fun? And I'll just say, I'm very serious about fun. I'm dead serious about fun. And I think that fun has three essential roles. We've been talking about it already, but the more that we do this, the more I learn it and I realize it and we experience it, is that first of all, fun allows us to come up with to open up the space for creativity, to come up with new solutions to problems that we've been facing for decades or centuries. And second of all, fun overturns those entrenched power dynamics. As soon as we start laughing and everyone is playing something together, we're not the somberness of traditional democracy is there to uphold power. And as soon as we take that away, we start to break down those power dynamics. And finally, just again, fun gets people to show up. And these kinds of processes, the challenges that Roberto's talking about, that all these processes, we're not going to change them in one go. We need people to show up over and over and over. Every participatory democracy is iterative. We make little changes each time. And if we're not creating a structure that makes it irresistible to come back, then I think we're already failing. So those are just three key reasons why for me that is so important. And that's what gets me excited about this.
So I can take over. I think that for me, it was a double kind of frustration, slightly different from Katy's, but I've been researching different participatory methods, and even those like in the US that are embedded for decades and they are obligatory. And I was surprised how tokenistic they are. And at the same time, in my activist work, we've been using forum theater and theater of the oppressed, but not yet legislative theater. So when I learned about this approach, I was thinking, well, it seems like a very powerful method, and I already knew the power of theater. What I didn't know was those steps towards the social change and legal change. And I think what was most convincing for me was this double kind of in-depth engagement. So first of all, this embodied character. So people have to come. It's not just you tick or you fill in a survey or you go and you vote once in 4 or 5 years, but you need to come, you need to show up either as actors or as members audience, and you're embedded in this theatrical experience. And as Katy said, fun is making you participate and encourages you to work further. in this aspect. But also the second thing, and we already mentioned that legislative theater aims to look into the problem, and also into the problems that seems to be unresolved for years and decades, because it aims to frame the problem from the beginning, from the perspective of those who are affected by it, rather than just to say, yes, we prefer A to B, and to aggregate the preferences. So for me, I would say those were the factors that made me a legislative theater practitioner.
Well, I mean, to me, legislative theater came out a bit as a surprise. I mean, I was not that into arts-based methods, and but I was very curious. So when I started with Sonia and the team in the project Inspire, and I heard about legislative theater, I got even more curious about this practice. So I thought, why not? Let's take it as a challenge, a positive challenge, also to to understand and know more about this world of participatory and deliberative processes. And I was also maybe also in line with what Bart was just saying. As a researcher, I'm a bit tired of reading stuff that put in the footnote that the process, it was very good, it was a success, but actually, we didn't have the most marginalized groups participating, so it was mostly about middle class, white men, blah, 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 blah. And I think this is not about the footnote. This is about the failure of many participatory processes. So I was a bit tired, and I wanted to test legislative theater to see whether this more bottom-up practice could work. And as I said, I mean, in my experience, my only experience so far, it worked. To me, the most rewarding part was at the end of the theater that we had in Lisbon, when one of the performers on the stage got so emotional and almost cried and said, "You changed my life today, because from now on, I know that I can rely on other people. And so we can build a coalition and change and try to change the things." So to me, this is what participation is about.
If I may ask about some technical aspects. Well, we know that the inclusion is at the center, at the heart of the method. But how to make it inclusive? When we think about external inclusions or openness towards the group at the risk of social and political exclusion, how do you organize the recruitment process? And then during the process, about internal inclusion, people have got different skills. How do you make them to participate? How to not really make them to participate, but how you support them to contribute so that the input is equal? These are my worries, and I really would like to know from you experience in legislative theater, and I hope this is also the question that other people may have. Shall I address this question, Dena?
Sure.
Would you be eager to help us to understand?
Absolutely, and that it's exactly right. Representation and participation are baked into legislative theatre. And reflecting on our own process in the Inspire project, we actively recruited youth co-creators from communities who were most impacted by youth unemployment issues, but also who were marginalized in lots of different ways. And we tried our best to approach this with an intersectional perspective. And what that means is not trying to stack their inequalities up in categories and go, right, well, you're a working class young person, you're this, you're that. but more trying to understand young people's lived experiences shaped by matrix of oppressions. And to create space for participation, we didn't take we asked for expressions of interest rather than call them applications. We didn't select the most polished expressions of interest from those with lots of experience. We tried to prioritize young people who showed a passion for social change or for the arts, but had never really been involved in similar activities before. In fact, only 5 out of our 15 youth co-creators came from a youth or community organization, and the other 10 had no prior involvement in any kind of collective action, whether it was political or arts-based. And rather than asking young people in the expressions of interest to give us, a tick box of their experiences of marginalization, what's your race, what's your class, what's your this and that, we decided to scrap that, and we invited them to describe their backgrounds and their experiences of inequality, left the box open and didn't tell them how much to write. And people shared really rich accounts of, their life experiences and what inequality meant to them and what was going on in their lives. And they talked about lots of different kinds of things, and it gave us a more complex understanding of what was going on for them. And, we worked with trusted grassroots organizations to spread the word and to make sure that we were reaching beyond, Roberto, I liked what you said about, getting a bit tired of kind of the usual suspects, and we were really aware that this can happen even with the best of intentions, and to make sure that we were not only reaching young people from more marginalized spaces, but that we were creating the space where they would be able to participate. Accessibility was really key, so covering food and travel, making sure that the co-creators were paid for their time throughout the process was really important. And in terms of, Anna, your question about, well, how do we create an equitable space within the process? Well, young people were invited to contribute in ways that worked for them from the start. Some young people said, look, I don't want to be on stage, or I don't want to do this, or maybe can I do it like that? And we thought about, as a team, and our facilitators, our legislative theatre facilitators, were incredible at creating an inclusive space where young people were invited to engage in co-creating scripts, to engage in the policy debates, to facilitate dialogue either with other youth co-creators or with policymakers in impact interviews after the performances. They produced podcasts, they engaged in kind of reviewing the proposed policy changes with decision makers after the policy process had gotten underway, and really quite critically helped shape the narrative and co-design the solutions that they felt were necessary to address youth unemployment issues in the West Midlands. And I suppose I'll end by kind of leading with, ending, I should say, with a provocation of whether it's legislative theatre or other participatory methods, it's not always possible to ensure that you're engaging with marginalized groups and that they are either remaining in those processes or that they are recruited in the first place. I think about the Theatre of Climate Action, our work in Guadeloupe in South Africa. And yes, we can say that we platformed the voices of majority world young people. But in South Africa, for instance, the young people were university students, and they were really acutely aware of, like, well, hold on, when, we have certain social advantages here in higher education. Surely young people who are living in mining affected communities in South Africa are a much better place to be having these kinds of conversations and having their lived experience platformed through performance art and through participatory theatre. And in those conversations, we talked about time and funding constraints being a massive issue for us. And the fact that we didn't have those resources meant we couldn't engage with the young people that our process, our democratizing process, was meant to seek out and support. So even when the method's right, sometimes the structural constraints that we live in as researchers or as practitioners can really fall short of serving those communities we aim to support. And that's just something for us to hopefully talk more about in this space together. Back over to the group.
Can I just chime in with one little bit there that I think is important? A couple things to add is that it's not always an application process. Sometimes there's a community organized that's already banging on the door of the council or the government, and they're working on this issue already, and they're saying, okay, we are ready with our stories. So there's not necessarily always, and there's not, this was this particular project with a kind of academic structure, but there's projects that are direct collaborations between community groups and governments. And that's really key, that those groups are already poised and ready. And then the other thing that I want to say clearly is that Dena's doing that's describing the young people who are the actors, but there's another community, which is the audience. And that's also a participatory role that has much more flexibility in terms of how people participate. So sometimes there's young people or participants or whatever who want to frame the problem. That's what we call the actors. That's what Dana's describing. But then there's the spectators who analyze the problem and can suggest, test out, come on stage, come up and try out ideas, but also just be in the dialogue, also write ideas from their seat. They don't have to get up. And so there's lots and lots of ways to participate. But this is a key difference between citizens' assemblies or PB and legislative theaters, that the community is both framing the problem and coming up with the solutions. And so there's two levels of community, the most directly impacted, and then the wider group, which could be by sortition, but certainly should be also reflecting people who are working around the problem. And you can have multiple performances gathering lots and lots and lots of policy suggestions from lots and lots of communities. So in the map that we talked about, we've tracked legislative theater processes that went on for 8 years with 5,000 audience members. So you can have really, really wide input, and that does not have to be the same that's not the same process. It's not the same commitment of time, but it is still actually coming up with the solutions. So that's really important.
I see that questions from participants popping up. So let me ask maybe the last question for you, combining the question about representativeness. Here voting, because there is with the impact. So I imagine that this measurable element of the procedure, like voting, is important. So it's important that the voting is well informed, that the proposals before are well informed. So proposals, as I understand, sorry, I'm trying to reflect. They are well informed because they are co-created with policymakers and lawyers, right? But then there is this element of voting. So who is eligible to vote? Because it's powerful. So we know that impact that's of these methods and broadening the impact from bottom up, that's what motivated you to try or to implement legislative theater. But now coming to the impact itself, how it's measured and how it can be performed. Well, I would like to know more about the voting element and how representativeness may matter here.
Is that for me? Should I keep?
It's for you. Sorry, I combined the questions about the voting, informativeness of voting, maybe for you, for Bartek.
Okay. I'll start and I'll pass it to Bartek. So just about the informed part. So one of the parts of the process is participatory research. So, and I mean, again, everyone does things a little bit differently. But for example, right, as Roberto was talking about, if the group has identified some issues and they said, okay, it's about one of the issues is accessibility and transport. And then they start telling stories, and the stories are about when, right, from the rehearsal, I'm just thinking about the stories. The stories are about when you look online and it says this station is accessible, and then you show up at that station after all the work it takes to get there, and it's not accessible, or the elevator's out of order, or it's not accessible depending on somebody's access needs, etc. And then this brings up questions for us. What are the definitions of accessibility that the city government is using? Are they up to some national standard, international standard, or not? What are the consequences for construction companies if they're not following those standards? We found out there are very few consequences. This brings up another question, right? So we can go all the way. How are those things getting updated on the website? How frequently? What are the, all of these kinds of questions. And in the best case scenario, the group is identifying those questions together and then figuring out how to find the answers to them as much as possible from the policy partners who are already involved. So we know we're working with this ministry, we know we're working with this city agency, or I see Paul's question, in the processes that I'm working on, usually, and this comes to the voting and the legitimacy too, usually in the processes that I'm working on, the government has actually made a commitment to implement a change from this process at the starting point and has paid for it or somehow commissioned it and lent that kind of accountability. So there's a real clear connection to the people who are going to be implementing the changes and carrying them forward in the process. So we're able to go back to them and say, what are all the bits of information? And then you reflect them back into the play. I'll give one more example of this really briefly, then I'll pass to Bartek. One of the boroughs in London was doing a homelessness strategy. And one of the issues that one of the actors was talking about was about the security outside the homeless shelters who were harassing people and shaking their personal belongings out into the rain and making them stand outside, and really, really violent. And the first question we have is, okay, so the audience would think if they saw this scene, how do we retrain the security officers? This is the problem. But first we started to do this research a little bit more. We said, wait a minute, what's going on around the security? Not only how are they trained, but how much is spent on security? And we found a figure. Right? It was £800,000 a year for this borough. And then the actors said, well, we want to put that in the play because actually a deeper question is this money being spent in the right way? And if there is any concerns of violence or conflict in the shelter, could that be addressed in a different way? Like in redesigning the shelter for a more welcoming and friendly space, or in conflict resolution training, or this kind of stuff. And that actually led to those kinds of proposals because that informed scene in the play led people to think, oh, now I'm thinking not just about the security and their behavior, but about the spending priorities of the council and the actual needs of the people. And so we came up with much more radical proposals that then became part of the strategy about actually redesigning the entire homelessness services centers with food, welcoming hosts, all these kinds of things as a way to reduce conflict and create a different environment. So that's the kind of informative work. And because we're working from the beginning, like other best practices, participatory democracy, we can get the answers to those questions along the way. I think Bartek, do you want to take the voting?
You can wrap up with the voting, but I will
Okay.
continue on the impact and
Okay. So, I mean, the voting is done lots of different ways. I think there's many different ways to do voting. As Roberto said, we usually use, because Augusto Boal did, and it's also very theatrical and fun, these sort of red and green cards. So green means consent and red means some kind of dissent or some concern. Sometimes we vote to give a top priority to one of the proposals so that we have the kind of ranking of urgency of the proposals. Other times we want to vote to ratify the key proposals. Essentially what we want to say with the voting is that everyone who is here, so in the processes I run, the policymakers and the participants can vote. Everyone's a citizen, just like in an election, right? Everyone's a voter and everyone can vote. And the voting is to me, voting is very important, but actually voting is not the only thing. Voting should celebrate the hard work that we've done together. So voting is an act of joyful celebration, saying, look at what we've done together. If the work has been done right, we're already at a very near consensus through all of this mutual understanding and deliberation and having seen the ideas played out in front of us. So by the time we vote, we're celebrating the work we've done to get to that consensus. So I would say actually the voting is a theatrical mechanism and a celebratory mechanism more than anything else. Bartek, over to you.
Thank you. So just maybe a comment on this voting aspect, because I do agree it is important, but it's very symbolic. And the way also many of us work is that we do one or two plays only. But if we have processes, as Katy mentioned, with 15 or 50 plays, then the proposals will evolve. So you cannot vote on the play one on the proposals that will occur only after these years of the process. So I think this is important to remember. And this brings me, the voting brings me to legitimacy and my legal background and this kind of democratic sometimes fixation on voting that we see during the elections is not always the efficient and the best way to actually make decisions. And I think sometimes we forget when we speak about legislative theater, and sometimes tend not to read it through Boal or other texts about legislative theater, that usually what we do is we do not really create laws. We create suggestions that are then being taken, be it by implementing bodies, administrative agencies, or the councils. So actually, it doesn't really matter if the proposal was made by 10, 15, or 100 people. Of course, it is better because more the people, the more informed decision, we hope, becomes. But ultimately, the decision is made through the legislative process that is legitimate. And I think this is important to also recall. And this act of voting indeed can be informed, but it really depends, again, on the design and the context of each legislative theater process. And maybe to slightly dwell into the question of Paul about translating the policy changes. So Katy said that her approach is to have policymakers on board and usually to make them accountable and to have them as the sponsors. And this is something I call collaborative legislative theater. But we have also other approaches because sometimes we have issues that it is the policymakers that are being the problem and issues that the policymakers do not want to tackle, or they are the main obstacles. So then we can also use legislative theater in a way that I call more political or critical, where you don't really want to collaborate, but you want to use this theatrical reunion to make the group to figure out how to work together, to co-organize and self-organize, and to think about different political actions, often that have nothing to do with theater, to challenge the status quo and to challenge the relations of power. And the last thing about the impact I would like to say, we also see quite a few processes that do not have a very strong advocacy phase. So they usually end up or figure out through theatrical work the problem and propose some recommendations. And we could say, yeah, but recommendations are not enough. I believe sometimes they are the best we can achieve with the resources we have, and sometimes they can lead to something else. But we have also to remember that the end goal of legislative theater is not just the legal changes. Katy said participation is iterative, and there are many examples where we fight for a bill that once it's promulgated, it's nothing as of what we wanted. So we really need to remember that even if we think about legislative theater as a tool to implement or change laws, the work doesn't end here, because it can be that the practice of implementing this law will be, again, something that we'll have to work around through theater or not.
Thank you for this explanation. The first question that I see on the list is from Filipa, and she would like to know the difference between legislative theater and the theater of the oppressed, if I understood it correctly. Any of you would like to answer the question?
So just as we said before, and we can certainly, there's lots of literature on this. We definitely recommend the resources on the People Act. There's lots of resources about legislative theater and theater of the oppressed around. But theater of the oppressed is a set of practices that are all about working towards justice and liberation using theater and activism. Legislative theater is sort of a branch of that. But again, the basic model of forum theater of the oppressed is that people who are directly impacted create a play which asks a question about a problem. They invite in their neighbors and friends, and they invite people to come up on stage, test out new ideas, and have a dialogue about how those might work. The legislative theater is using that model, but just involving structures or decision makers or whoever the people are and the structures are that will advance those ideas into structural change. So we have some further steps that help turn those improvisations and that dialogue into proposals, then deliberation, then voting. Those steps, as we've all been saying, are different in every process, but really it's based on that model, and it's saying, can we use this to think about laws, rules, designs, structures, and who else needs to be in the room, and what other steps do we need to turn those issues and those ideas into concrete proposals and action?
There's three questions from Emina. I think one referred to this comparison as well. So there's two left. The first is about how it's possible to become a facilitator in the process. So what kind of skills or competencies do you need to have? Is it the question about that, Emina? So yeah, it's the question about becoming the facilitator. Can you answer, Katy, maybe you again?
Sure. I was just going to comment again on Paul's in the chat question. How to become a facilitator? I mean, that's a great question. Well, I think there's trainings, just like there are for other, processes. We can certainly, again, point you to resources. I guess I have a couple more kind of theoretical things to say about being a facilitator. One of them is that, so in the ethos of the theater of the oppressed, again, there's this idea of the bird of multiplication, that nothing is for consumption. We're not just receiving any of these things. We can also multiply them. We can recreate them. So my best practice is that in every process, there's an element of facilitation training, or in as many as possible. So lots of the processes I do, we actually embed that people who are acting in the process then get facilitation training. So the two people who led the process in Birmingham that Dena's talking about had been actors in another youth project and then trained with me extensively over months, and then had already implemented several other processes as kind of apprentices or support, and then really led on this process in Birmingham and are now working in that and about to start another process in the UK. So, and that's also the case kind of, when we work with homelessness, we think about who can be part of leading this process. I just did a project with Northern Ireland government with women experiencing homelessness and domestic violence. And after the project, there was a training for the entire group. And now that organization is running a new legislative theater project, and a bunch of the actors in that group are leading that. And I will say again, referring to Roberto's great project, in the ethos of this and the best case scenario, and Anna was talking about inclusion, to me, it's that the people who are leading the process are also impacted by the issue and have some connection to the issue. This is true across every kind of social change and participatory process. Roberto, go ahead.
Can I just tell one thing about it? What made, we had two artists, two performers who also facilitated during the interaction with the audience. And to me, what made, what improved a bit also the skills of about facilitation was that during the rehearsals that we have had before the legislative theater, we realized that, especially when we had people from outside interacting with us, we realized that many of the questions or the proposals were about changing the mindset, changing the social mindset, or changing the culture. So, very open and in some cases also very vague proposals. So what we did was to ask, we didn't ask really, but we realized that we needed to be a bit more provocative in the facilitation. So every time someone from the audience said, this is the problem of discrimination is about mindset, we should change the mindset of the people. We should somehow provoke another kind of proposal, like saying, we know this is an issue, this is a serious issue, but here we are to talk about policies. Here we are to talk about laws. So please be more specific. Give us examples. Tell us how can we practically change these discriminatory behaviors or whatever was the issue. So, and this changed a bit the way the performers facilitated, also because the performers themselves, as Katy said, are directly affected by those proposals. So they are the first to be very much interested in getting very practical ideas, not just, very open and generic ideas about changing the society. If you know what I mean.
So the last question from Amina is about evaluation. That's an interesting question. Evaluation is important in the Inspire project, and it's participatory per se. So how do you organize it in your projects of legislative theatre? Question to Elsie, whoever wants to. Mm-hmm.
I can start. So first of all, I think, and I don't know if colleagues will share that impression, but it's quite difficult to have a full evaluation of the process in terms of resources and time. So what I personally try to do is to gather the insights from the participants, but also I think like we need to see the difference whether we are talking about the evaluation of the legislative theater process itself and how to improve it and how did it go, or whether we are talking about evaluating the impact of the process. And I think both are important, but the first one is linked rather with the one's practice and improving and making sure that we are doing the best that we can. And the second one is about seeing if the social change is happening. As already Katy wrote in the chat, is that it is often that there are scrutiny groups that are set up from the members of the group, from the actors team, including the decision makers, that are making sure and working towards the implementation of the ideas and recommendation. But still, it can be a year, it can be 2 years. But I do believe it is still a little bit difficult and something we should work on as practitioners to have more aligned way of assessing the impact and monitoring the impact. And I know that Katy is doing that for most or some of her projects, but unfortunately it is also not easy, since often the resources are limited and we move on, and it can be sometimes challenging. So that would be my part of the answer. I don't know if anyone would like to chime in on that.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, like other processes, it's good practice to survey the audience, to survey the actors, to survey the policymakers. We do this as much as we can. Not necessarily in, always in a super academic way with, super long and whatever surveys, but just kind of some way to evaluate their experience. But yes, I'm really interested in tracking the concrete outcomes as well as the long-term impacts. So the map that we've been referencing is talking about both immediate impacts and long-term impacts, like inspiring new kinds of participatory democracy, right? Which we're very interested in looking at, all of us as part of this field. I'll put in the chat now a link to this new report about concrete policy impacts that have come out of a dozen legislative theatre processes in the UK in the last couple of years.
In terms of what's happening in the West Midlands, I've just added into the group a link to our policy tracker so that you can also keep track of what it looks like to track the policy changes over time, when embeddedness and thinking about how to embed change beyond the lifetime of these kinds of projects has been a big focus for us, and is a big focus on the Inspire project. Internally, in terms of the participatory evaluation and thinking about how our youth co-creators were evaluating the process, they did that along the way using lots of different creative arts methods. They used podcasts, they interviewed each other, they wrote blogs and wrote poems and spoken word poetry, and they also co-wrote the report, a public-facing report that I'm sure we can share. That gives a sense of what the process meant to them, and what was achieved, and what they wanted to see happen afterwards, and that kind of, that's also another layer of impact is thinking not just about the policy impact, but the impact on them as political agents and what the experience has led them to do moving on from the process. And lots of them have been involved in very interesting community, social, political activities since, which is incredible to see.
And we have one more question on the chat from Shin. Maybe any of you can take
I'm
it.
happy to start on this
Thank
one
you.
because it caught my attention. So the question is, which elements of legislative theater address the limitation of creating solutions? For example, it has always been that way. It's too difficult, expensive. Are people with this mindset participating in the process at all? So I would say we tackled that a little bit. And the first element that is allowing for the creativity is fun. So we break with the limitations when the group is allowed to have fun and to create the play. And I would say the whole method aims to allow the community through the play and through theater to search for the solutions. And I would say those who are becoming the actors, they know the problems by heart, so they want to seek for the solutions that they need, and they don't want to be constrained. But of course, it can be different when it comes to this meeting of the audience and the actors, where we have, as we already said, usually majority of people who also have this experience, but sometimes we have people from the community who are not necessarily, for example, in favor of the changes, or who do not think that certain things are possible. And I would say those who say it's too difficult, it's too expensive, unfortunately, are often the decision makers. And this is why I believe that, you know, this collaborative approach to legislative theater can be very useful and very fruitful, but can be also very demanding. And, you know, this role of experts and how expertise is being tackled within the process is a very sensitive one. And it's basically another power play, right? So we want to make sure, and this unfortunately happens sometimes, that experts and decision makers understand very well their role, and that they do not tend to hijack the process. Because imagine having people doing the play for a couple of weeks, doing multiple plays, and then policymaker comes and they say, no, it's not possible. No, it's stupid. And we know this example by heart. So this is something we need to deal with. But I would say the core of the legislative theater is also to escape this enclosure of what is possible, what is constitutional, what is cheap enough. No, we want the ideas to flow. And then, of course, if something is too radical, if something is perhaps beyond the capacity or power we have within the process, we can think how to aim at this change, what other resources do we need. But I do believe the whole goal of legislative theater is to not be constrained with the constraints we have in democracy and everyday policymaking.
Next, Katarzyna and Mateusz would like to ask questions in person. And Katarzyna, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm trying to figure it out also with my camera. Okay, so my name is Katarzyna Anna Klimowicz from the Social Dialogue Unit at Minister's Office at the Ministry of Digital Affairs of Poland. I'm very sorry for not being very visible and active during this seminar. I'm trying to listen to you all the time, but I also have some important tasks to be done by the end of the day. So I just wanted to let you know that I'm very interested in testing and implementing various participatory and deliberative methods within public administration. And as a representative of the Ministry of Digital Affairs, I am particularly interested in methods that can be applied by administration at the central level of governance. So if possible, I would be very grateful and very happy if it would be possible to share also some concrete examples of legislative theater method being applied by the government on the countrywide very central level, as well as in the context of the topic of digitalization. And yeah, at the same time, I would like to thank you very much for organizing this very interesting online meeting. And again, sorry for not being able to participate fully, although I would really like to be more involved, and I will definitely keep in touch with Professor Przybyska to continue our collaboration, as well as propose some dates to meet with Oliver from Platonic next week, because I also see he's present here in this meeting. So greetings from Warsaw to everyone, and with some of you, we will hear each other very soon.
Thank you. I will jump in and I'll keep it quick so we have time for the last question. So yes, legislative theater projects with national governments are slower, but are happening. So I mentioned one, I'm working on several right now. I think the national government in the UK is picking up legislative theater at a quicker pace right now. So one that I mentioned before was actually the national government has a new intellectual property legislation, and incredibly, the Department for Education convinced the government, the prime minister really, or to hold a section of this legislation blank for young people to create themselves via legislative theater about young people's rights to their homework, which is being mined by a big tech in education and then used to create materials that they're profiting from. And so it was super concrete and specific, and involved, as I said, members of parliament, Department for Education, and the tech companies, as well as students and teachers and parents. And the proposals are now making their way through into the development of this legislation that are actually about, again, young people's rights to review the way their work is being used, young people's financial contribute or kind of retribution for their work. All this is coming out of it. The next project that's happening right now is about a new framework UK-wide for student-teacher relationships to create a more engaging environment in secondary schools, understanding that engagement and welcoming environments actually are creating better results than just homework and attendance. And so that is happening across the UK. I think the link here, and then there's one more project in development that's very interesting, also as a digital component. It's about farmers and policies that farmers are struggling to follow around kind of sustainability between farmers and the Department for Rural Affairs and Agriculture. And so this is I think what national government is seeing, and yes, of course, there's like more kind of adverse, challenges in taking risks in terms of new projects and thinking about using arts-based methods. But anywhere where there's a breakdown in understanding between people's lived experiences and the policy, that's where national or central governments are really seeing the opportunity to use these processes. Happy to talk about it more. Actually, one resource is there's a webinar on the 23rd of January where 4 policymakers, 2 from central government in the UK, are going to talk about how they have convinced their colleagues to buy into legislative theater and other innovative processes, how policymakers can take risks about things like this. So you can find that in the People Act. But it's a great question. And I think we have one more.
We have 2 more, one from Mateusz and one from Marta. Mateusz, please.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, I'm Mateusz from Field of Direct Foundation, practitioner from Warsaw, Poland. And it's funny because the whole team of my organization keeps laughing at me that I am not a big fan of legislative theater, but as you can see, I've been trying for quite for a while to get convinced, and absolutely this amazing webinar, this amazing seminar helped me to believe. But still, I have some doubts, because I am convinced, of course, that this is a really great tool, a really fun one, really inspiring one. But I am still looking for evidence, to be a good policy-making tool, also to scaling up and to institutionalize also in context like Polish context, where we don't have so high political culture, also among citizens and also among decision makers. I mean, participatory culture. And to be honest, I mean, my main issue is recruitment. I mean, the challenge of getting beyond the bubble. Yeah, I mean, this is what originally brings me to the deliberative methods, because there in deliberative methods we're trying to approach this differently. And I wanted to ask you about information bubbles in legislative theater. That's my intuition. That's not a fact, but is it possible that people from marginalized groups are in even tighter bubble, meaning that those who agree to take part in such a process may not reflect the real problem we actually want to surface or work on this in the process? And that's my question, that's my doubts, and that's my also question to you. Is that challenge for you? I mean, working with the bubble, and is there any examples of legislative theater being implemented with recruitment approach other than targeted, project-based outreach, yeah, and not just reaching out to the people you already know or volunteers in our organization or stuff like that, or young leaders and stuff like that, but maybe with sortition on with other approaches. So that's my question. I hope that's not last question, because it should be happy question as a final one.
I think it's also a happy question, and maybe I can start to answer to this one. And as we all said and agree, each process, including legislative theater process, needs to be adapted to the context and to the needs and to the problem. So of course we can think about different ways of recruitment, and as Katy said, you can have the community that already has the problem and the need and is organized, so you don't really need such a wide recruitment. But of course there are topics like climate that I mentioned, where you can imagine that the interest could be much wider, and you could think about other ways of recruiting. But again, I've been thinking about this issue of representativeness from the legal perspective for quite a long time. And I think we need to remember that we have different methods for different goals. And while, for example, having this demographic representation is important and can be fruitful, here I would say what we can gain with legislative theater when we look less maybe to this idea of representativeness, is to giving the voice to those which are not often heard. And I think this is very important. And what I also see, within the processes of legislative theater, but what you can also read about it, if within the group you have the people who are not really feeling attached to this problem, they will usually leave, because they will not feel the connection with the issue they are working on. So my answer to that is usually you can have, if you tackle, for example, I don't know, the issue of housing, you can have legislative theater on the rough sleeping, but you can also have a legislative theater on housing equality or access to the housing. So the bigger problem can be divided into different aspects managed by different groups, and then it can be perhaps combined in a more joint reflection. But my view is that it's not really suitable legislative theater to invite everyone who wants, because this is how democracy works. Because of how democracy works, we sometimes have the problems we want to solve through legislative theater.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in, Anna? Yeah, very
Yes,
short.
please.
I know.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that this issue about representativeness is somehow sometimes is used to say something. Okay, let me put it differently. So, participatory and deliberative processes have never pursued statistical representativeness of the population. This has never been the goal. We have always talked about sociological representativeness. So what we want to make sure is that these processes can give the chance to a diverse set of people to express themselves. And even most importantly, what we want to do is to bring those minorities into the arenas where they normally don't have a voice. Okay, this is basically what we want to do. We don't want to reproduce this idea of statistical representativeness. And I would also say, in addition to that, I mean, we should also be a bit more critical about the way representativeness is used in electoral methods, because if we think that, for example, half of the population votes today in Western democracy, and this is for us representativeness, then we have a problem. So, I mean, legislative theater is just another participatory or deliberative process that tries to give more voice to those minorities. Is not seeking to, reflect the representativeness of the whole population, which to me leads to one important thing, which is there are negative biases, but there are also positive biases. And in my own experience, the positive bias of adding a legislative theater on disability was to have people interested on the topic. So it is true, Mateusz, it was a bubble. It was a bubble. We were more than 170 people in the room, and all those people were interested in finding solutions about disability. But that's fine. I mean, that's okay, because the topic our focus was disability. So why should we look for for people who are not interested in disability in that case, in that specific case? So there are biases that to me are positive biases. Then I don't know if I made myself clear, but I hope so.
Thank you, Roberto. Sorry for for extending our meeting, but let's take the last question, Marta.
Yeah, thank you. So sorry. Thank you for these great presentations. And I'm also a member of the Center for Deliberation, and I'm working on nationwide problems. So part of my question was already answered. This was in reply to Katarzyna's question on can this work for this kind of problems? Nonetheless, what would you say is the utility of legislative theater when you have a problem that is like strongly mapped politically? So people will care, they will be interested, like thousands will come, but they will have very firm, well-established opinions, and they will perform their opinions so ritualistically, so to say. Have you an experience of that kind? I'm thinking like, direct taxes, security spending, healthcare, these kind of things at the nationwide level. And also for the nationwide problems, like security spending again, like in a sense, everyone has skin in the game and nobody does. So do you just allow anyone in, like full self-recruitment, or do you strive to pre-format the gathering a bit? What is I'm trying to understand the method a bit more because I'm not really very familiar with it. So I would appreciate any thoughts on that. Thank you. And sorry for being so long.
It's a great question. I actually really have to go myself. I have another meeting right now and I'm running late. So I was going to say I'm happy to talk more about these things. I think just like any democratic process, if I understand the question correctly, we need to get as many perspectives in as possible. So we don't try to exclude people who have different opinions. Certainly some people won't self-select to come to something if there's a perspective like, let's end homelessness. If you don't want to end homelessness, you might say, I don't want to come to that event, right? So that there's a bit of selection in the kind of framing of it. But other than that, we want the difference in political and kind of, social perspective, because that's going to create the best solutions. I have to sign off, but I'm really happy to chat with anyone in the future. Thanks.
If I can quickly chime in to this question, again, I think what is important, and we see it very, very vividly in legislative theater processes, that we have this idea that the groups are homogeneous, or it's I am yes for abortion or no, and so on and so on. But if you put, so to speak, 20 or 15 people from the minority group and tell them, okay, let's think about the issue of homelessness, for example, that you have all experienced. you will also have 10 or 15 different ideas on what should we do. So within the communities, there is often also quite a variety of ideas and quite a work to be done to arrive at certain joint solutions that them, for example, as a group would like to pursue. So as Katy said, it's not to exclude anyone, but also it's important to remember what the goal and strengths of legislative theater process is. It's not to aggregate, it's not to gather all the opinions, but really to go in depth and look. We have 5 possibilities, right? So, for example, what we can do. Do we want to do something that will be implemented shortly, or we want to do something that will have the greatest impact? But it is really the method, as Roberto also said, that we want to dive into certain problems with delay experts. And then we can take it further. We can use it as recommendations. We can do citizens assemblies about it. There is a lot of things that we can do, but this initial stage and the core of the method is to invite those directly affected. And depending on the topic, it can be the whole nation, it can be regional community, or it can be a minority.
Shall we wrap up then? Thank you so much. Thank you to all our wonderful panelists. Thanks to everyone. And I think we can share some resources, some from the chat, suggestions for literature, also the analysis that's by you, our experts, and maybe a suggestion for events where people can deepen their knowledge, because it was just 1.5 hour event, but there is need for more learning, apparently. So if you know about any events, future events that people can enroll into, so it would be welcomed, I suppose. Thank you a lot. And yeah, it was encouraging, enlightening, and yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Anna, for organizing it. Okay.
Thank you, Anna, too.
Thank you.